Hey everybody, this is Andrew, CTO of concrete5. We're about to get this developer training underway. Since there are going to be just under the limit of people in this room, I'm going to just take the mic at this point. And if anyone has any questions, there will be a few times throughout this training where we can do, where I can do Q&A. But if you want to type them in the chat window, that would be helpful, and then I'll probably read them aloud to everyone. So yes, this is the developer introduction to concrete5. Kind of assumes you have at least some understanding of or some experience using concrete5 and perhaps a bit of PHP knowledge. And we're going to first get started talking about kind of what we mean when we describe certain concepts in concrete5, kind of the glossary and terminology section. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen.
You can see a regular concrete5 site here. We're not going to get quite down into it yet, but as I navigate this regular concrete5 site, which is just your typical website, and I click around in the nav, I'm visiting different pages in my website, and this is the easiest to grasp concept behind concrete5 is the concept of a page. You'll see pages referenced all throughout developer stuff when talking about concrete5. And when we say page, this is what we mean. We mean the actual web page that you're navigating to when you're visiting a website. A page has a URL. It has content on it. Pages extend a class called collection, and we called them, this is actually what we used to call pages in Concrete prior to concrete5. So if I, for example, log into my concrete5 website and I edit a page, you can see right there in the URL I have CID equals 1, and CID is basically the ID of the page behind the scenes. So everywhere in a database, in the concrete5 database, anytime we add a page, it gets a new unique numeric identifier, and that is CID. So anywhere you see the ID, you see CID equals whatever, that is the ID of a page. And you might wonder why it's not. This is kind of analogous to WordPress has a post ID, you know, the primary key for the bit of content you're looking at. And you might be wondering why it's CID instead of something like page ID or whatever. And the reason for that is pages used to be called collections back in a previous version of concrete5. And that's why you see collection. That's why you see the term collection pop up throughout the code as well, because collections used to, when we first architected concrete, we conceived of the idea of blocks first. And if you've played with a concrete5 site, you're undoubtedly familiar with blocks, which is what these are. We conceived that we kind of built concrete from the inward first. We thought of the idea of blocks before we thought about how they might go together. And so we initially conceived of pages being called collections because they were in fact collections of blocks. And moving right along, you can see my particular page template has areas in it, and you've probably interacted with these. Areas contain blocks. It's pretty basic stuff. And so far, everything that we've found that we've talked about so far can be found, the class for each of these concepts in PHP can be found within the models directory in concrete5. Area, collection, page, etc. And like I mentioned before, every area can have blocks in it, and areas get added to pages, which is probably familiar to you if you've looked at a concrete5 page template. And pages that you add in concrete5 can be pages of a particular type. So in my sample site, when you add a page, these are all different page types, and they map to what we call templates in the particular active theme on your site. So my theme for my site is called Greek yogurt. That's the one that ships out of the box in concrete5. And you can see we are on the current home page, we are rendering the right sidebar page type in the Greek yogurt theme. So basically, anytime you add a page in concrete5, you have to choose a type, and those types are kind of meant to be either design. You might make a different page type based on design constraints, since it loads a different PHP template, or you might make a different page type because you want to use that page type behind the scenes for something programmatically, and we can talk more about that in the future. Those are kind of the basic. Those are the basic sort of content level, the basic content level concepts. So with all that stuff together, you basically build out your site. When you add a page and you put a page in edit mode, you see the areas, you see the blocks within the areas, and we will get to how those areas work and how to create those templates in a moment. So those are concepts for content, but as you know, Concrete has a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that make it kind of an application and authentication framework. It's got a full complement of sort of user level stuff for handling workflow and handling more robust needs that websites need than just content. So the first of these that we'll talk about is users. So in concrete5, you can make as many users as you want, and you can bundle them into groups. So groups are just collections of users. So if I added a group, that's just a listing. That's just a holder for users. And oops. And then I can put users I create into groups. And once you put users into groups, you can use that to control permissions on your site, which some of you probably have done. If you add, you can say, I want users in the developer training group as well to be able to edit this page, that type of stuff. You can also use users in groups completely programmatically. So what I mean by that is you can create groups, put users in them, and then in your PHP code, you can filter, you can say, give me all the users in this group, or you can find the currently logged in user object and check and see if they're in a particular group. The API for accessing that stuff is pretty easy. So moving right along, as we've talked here, and as you've probably seen as you played with the concrete5 site, you add pages and of particular types, and page types are basically meant to be reusable pages that you want to add to different parts of your website. So if we look at the page types that we actually have installed, we have blog entry, full, left sidebar, right sidebar. You can imagine a website reusing these pages throughout. However, there are plenty of times when you might want the flexibility of a concrete5 page without being able to necessarily reuse that. So what do I mean by flexibility? I might mean the ability to dump blocks and areas onto the page, the ability to have it editable through the CMS, including have its SEO properties be editable through the CMS, have permissions for a given page be available, but you might not want to see it every single time you add the subpage. So we have, that was one of the first problems that we encountered. We wanted to have a lot of pages in our site that were sort of required by the system and got to use permissions and things like that, but didn't necessarily show up as addable throughout the site. And so for that, we have the concept of single pages. So if I look through the concrete single pages directory, you can see there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. And some of this stuff may look familiar. Um, for example, login is actually a page in the site. And so when I navigate to index.php/login, it looks like I'm getting a login form, and I am. But if I actually look in my dashboard, in my sitemap, and I click this Show System Pages, in here, you can see that login actually shows up in my sitemap. Same with register, even the page not found page, the page that gets served up anytime I go to a URL that doesn't exist. Furthermore, even the dashboard shows up in here, and if I open the dashboard up, you can see I have kind of a hierarchical view of my dashboard that I can visit. So what I actually did was I visited my full sitemap page from my full sitemap. So basically what I want to communicate here is that when you install concrete5, you probably have 200 pages installed, or maybe 100 pages installed out of the box that you don't even know about. And those are all called single pages. They all get added into the system. They're all pages, but single pages just render the file that's found within the single pages directory. And it's just PHP, but since they're added into the system, you can set permissions on them. You can move them around, although moving a single page around is kind of weird because the directory structure of the single page is how you initially create it in terms of hierarchy in your site. So moving it around isn't necessarily recommended, but you could if you wanted to. You could change the design of it. You could delete it through the sitemap. You could do all sorts of stuff. So that's what single pages are. They're concrete5 pages that don't show up as addable to multiple sections of your site. And but it is easy for you to add them to your own site and for your own business practices. So this is kind of if you find yourself working on a concrete5 site and there's some bit of functionality you want to add of any kind, like a press room or a new registration page or a new form that collects data that's going to be really custom, you might want to use a single page for that, because then you don't have to worry about, especially if it's not going to be needed to be reused throughout your site. And moving right along, one of the other powerful parts of concrete5 are what we call attributes. So if you've played around with, if you've probably edited attributes even if you don't know what they are. If I click on a particular page in my site and I want to add some SEO stuff like the meta keywords or meta description, this kind of stuff. These are attributes, and attributes are basically ways of making it so that users can add their own custom fields that they want to store against either pages, users, or files that are that they can then search by, they can retrieve programmatically or within the page, and that are kind of extendable. So they're a lot like blocks in that you can install new types, you can install new instances of it with, you can write your own, and you can also create an attribute without touching code. But they're primarily meant to store data as opposed to presentational stuff. So if I go into, that's the user attributes. If I go into page attributes, you can see I have a number of different bits of data that I am storing for a given page. And some of these attributes we actually install by default and look to from within our core blocks. So exclude from nav is a good example. If you typically add the exclude from nav checkbox to a page, the AutoNav template is able to read that, and then it excludes that page from the navigation. So you can see that about went away because I turned on the exclude from nav flag. There's nothing magical about that attribute. It's just that the auto nav block is coded in such a way that when it decides which pages to show, it can retrieve the attribute, it checks against that attribute on a page, and if that attribute is set to true, it skips over it. So attributes can be used programmatically for a wide variety of stuff, and we use them all the time. Attributes kind of make it so that you could treat your concrete5 pages as almost like a database record or an object model. We definitely do that. We do that in certain cases as well. Attributes are, this is an example of attributes. You can see these little icons. Those are examples of attribute types. So if I wanted to add a new attribute to store against a page, actually let's add one to store against a user. That's a good one. Let's say I've already got these two attributes in there. Let's say I wanted to store some a bit of data against a user, like a nickname. So in this select menu, you can see all of my different attribute types, and that's what an attribute type is. It's kind of similar to a block type. A nickname is typically just a text field, so that's what I'm going to do. Since this is a user attribute, I can choose whether it's displayed in a profile, who can edit it, that kind of stuff. And then if I add that, I have nickname right there. And now if I go into my users, I see user attributes. There's no nickname set because it just got added. And I can scroll down and give myself a nickname. And then once I save it, it gets saved against a user record. And that works the same way for pages and for files as well. And finally, there's a concept of attribute categories. And that's just a way of saying what object an attribute is attached to. So if you go back to page attributes, these are all different attributes, and since the attribute system is sort of a centralized thing, they're all attributes in our system, but the reason our system knows to show them here for pages is because their attribute category is a page. So that's all that means. Moving right along, if you do plan on extending or on working with concrete5 as an application framework, or building a site that has some interactivity to it, you're going to probably want to know about helpers. I don't know who amongst us has used other MVC frameworks like CodeIgniter or CakePHP or something like that, but they typically have a concept of helpers, and helpers are just simple ways of they're sort of utility functions that make your life easier. And we can talk, if this is something of interest to you, we can talk a bit about how to call these helpers and that type of stuff. But there's a lot of documentation on concrete5.org. These are sort of general purpose tools. So for doing things like working with form fields, PHP functions for printing out HTML inputs, working with mail. So if you find yourself needing to send mail from your site, the concrete5 mail helper will be very useful to you. There's a spell checker helper, navigation for navigating your concrete5 site, that type of stuff. We'll probably come back around to that one because that's useful. Continuing on to look through the file system a bit more, we have the concept of models. So again, if you've played with an MVC framework before, models basically map to bits of data that you're saving in a database, whether directly by manipulating the database tables with SQL or through an active record pattern or something like that. In concrete5, models aren't there. There is an active record framework, but it's not really something we use all that much. It has some bugs in it, and it's tough for us to upgrade, unfortunately. So we write a lot of our own SQL today, at least. But what you can basically say as a rule of thumb in concrete5 is if something in the core is interacting directly with the database table, there is of a particular name, there's probably something in the models directory that maps to that. So, for example, there's a pages table in concrete5, and page is a model that we have in our models directory. And by contrast, libraries are sort of lower level than helpers. You're less likely to need to reuse them, which is why they're not helpers. But they don't necessarily map one-to-one to a database table. So, like a cache is a library because cache is sort of a system-wide it's a system for speeding up the site sort of holistically, and it loads up other frameworks. And finally, there's a third-party directory up here. So any type that we need libraries that we didn't write ourselves, they go in the third party. So ADODB is the database framework that we use to that's the database framework we use to connect to the database. We don't use the built-in MySQL stuff. We have a BB code library in the core. PHP, we have a library for sanitizing input to make sure that it's okay. We actually have a Python script in here that we use to diff contents between versions, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that we did not write that goes in the third party stuff, including a fair amount of Zen framework libraries. We're not built strictly on the Zen framework in terms of MVC, but we use a lot of their libraries for doing stuff like sending mail, working with the cache, dealing with localization and stuff like that. And finally, before I start walking through the dispatcher and how a concrete5 request works, I'll talk a little bit about the final sort of glossary concept you'll see around, and that's the concept of a tool. Tool is sort of a catch-all for stuff that we want, scripts that we want to run through a concrete5 environment, but that aren't really mapped to a page. So, for example, these are all scripts that run through concrete5, but they don't. They're not. You could dump anything in the tools directory, and if you call it properly, it will have access to a concrete5 environment, including the database, etc. So, and what does running it correctly mean? You'll notice that tools is a directory, and there's PHP scripts in here. So you might think that you could call something that you could call. What's a good example here? Upgrade is a good example here. You could call concrete tools upgrade, which is the script that we call to manage a sort of force an upgrade. You might think that you could call it directly, concrete tools upgrade, but that's not correct, because that would not give you access to a concrete5 session, because, as I said before, and what we're about to talk about is the concept of dispatcher. That's how every request in concrete5 for any resource, whether it's a tool, a page, etc., goes through index.php, which is our dispatcher. So what you actually do is you call this request like this, and that takes it through, that routes through index.php, which is just an inclusion to our dispatcher, and routes tools required upgrade into that script, which we then can see properly. So there's really, tools are scripts that you could dump anything into tools in the tools directory, and if you call it properly, it will have access to a minimal concrete5 environment, which is awfully handy when you want to connect to, when you want to do something custom, like a script that's going to run against your site without displaying a lot of data. So we use these a lot for Ajax stuff, all sorts of things like that. And before I keep going on to my next major section of topics, I'll answer a question that's in the chat. Brant is asking, can you add an image as an attribute? And the answer to that is yes. If you go into pages, attributes, you can see that we do in fact have image file as an attribute type. And so let's say I wanted to add an attribute called thumbnail to my page record. Now I've got thumbnail down there, and if I go to a page and I hit properties, if I click thumbnail, you can see that I do in fact get the concrete5 file manager as a chooser right there, and I can save that thumbnail against the page. If you go into the file manager, yeah, since it's an image or file, you can attach any kind of file to that attribute you want. Now, if you look at file attributes, you'll notice that image file does not show up as an attribute there, and that is because usually you won't need to associate an image or file with a file itself. However, if you do in fact need to do that, you can go into the attributes section in the system and settings, and this shows you how you can choose which attribute types are added to which parts of the site. And this is actually where you would install your own custom attribute types if you know how to make one. And there are some how-tos on concrete5.org that would talk about how to create your own custom attribute types. And this is actually also something we cover in the advanced developer training course. So if you find yourself wanting to explore attributes further, and Brant had a question, can videos go as an image file? And yes, they can, but if, for example, they're going to display the same way that all files do when they're file attributes. They're going to display just as links. So if you might find yourself saying, well, I want an attribute type for a video as opposed to an image/file because I have special custom stuff. You can create your own custom attribute types, but that's not something we go over in this class. But here you can choose which attribute types are available to which attribute categories throughout the site. And you can also see all the different attribute types here. So we have an address, which is an actual address for a particular user. So a postal location that has a list of a complete, street address 1, street address 2, city, state or province, and your country. I'm not sure when Oscar asks if we'll be having an advanced class. We probably will. We kind of schedule them. I don't know if we're going to do one the same way we did this one, but we kind of schedule them through the training section of the site. But I'll see if there's demand for something that's a little bit more like this class as opposed to a sort of more expensive one-off training, because if there's enough demand, we might schedule an advanced class that's like this one.